and we will be making the recording available on the ICS website for people who cannot make it. So please either behave yourself or leave. No, don't worry. No, I just think it's important that people do know that we are recording and that the recording will be posted on the ICS website for the benefit of people who cannot make it. So this is the second training session for methodology development. The training runs over a period of 3 weeks. The first one was on Tuesday, and for the coming 2 weeks, we will have sessions on the Tuesday and the Thursday as well. The first 3 sessions are very much theoretical. In the first one on Tuesday, we have covered the fundamentals of the ICS. Today, we will work through the methodology manual, which basically sets out the principles of methodology development. Next week, Tuesday, we will do a demonstration of the platform to get people to know their way around the platform. And then the last 3 sessions will be a actual methodology development. We have developed a couple of methodologies, and we will use them as examples and work through them step by step to get people to get familiar with the platform, the concepts, and the ultimate objective is to have people then to be able to navigate the platform and to develop methodologies. You have met Sarina a bit earlier. For those of you who are late, who came in slightly late, Sarina, if you can maybe just switch on your camera again and wave at the people. Sarina is in the Cape Town office of Prometheum, and she's really been the guinea pig on the methodology development side. She's been piloting the platform for quite a period now, so she's probably the person with the most practical experience in methodology development, and she is available to assist people who've got questions when we get to that point. So let me start by going into the presentation. I assume everybody can see. So if there are people who can't see the screen, please just let us know. But just the agenda for today. First of all, there's a number of manuals available on the ICS website. We'll just look at where they are. And then we go into the detail. This presentation I've got here today is very much a PowerPoint version of the methodology manual as it's on the ICS website at the moment. So when you download the methodology manual, you basically have, it's almost, as I said, there's a very high correlation between this presentation and the ICS methodology manual. Just to go into the location then. Sorry, I'm just clearing my screen here. The address you go to is inclusivecarbon.org. When you go to inclusivecarbon.org, you will find this, if you can see my cursor on the screen, this with this, the screen that's up in the left-hand corner here. There's a button where you can register on the platform and log in. And right at the top there, there's a button with the name Resources and Workshops. If you click there, it will pop up the screen that's in the middle here. And there's a small little drop down. I've actually dropped it down here already. It says read the ICS documentation. If you pull that one down, there's a little button that says view documentation. If you click on it, you get a list of the documents, and the document that we'll be covering today is the methodology manual, and this is what it looks like. So we'll dig right in. And as I said, this presentation of today is very much a PowerPoint version of the methodology manual that you will download. So it's going to be slightly boring, but it is training. And if training is not boring, I think it doesn't qualify as training. So just please hang in there. The first part that we look at is why we develop component methodologies. For those of you who are familiar with carbon programs and carbon registration, carbon project registration, you'll know that in programs like, for instance, the CDM, the BCS, and Gold Standard, all of them work with approved methodologies. The approved methodology is basically the recipe that you use to implement the project. And the only difference, or there's a couple of differences between those programs and the ICS, and we'll highlight it here. So when the first use of a component methodology is when a project owner or a project developer wants to register his project on the ICS. In that registration process, a project owner will log on to the website. He will say, I want to develop a new project. And when he says he wants to develop a new project, he will be presented with a list of available component methodologies. At the moment, the website is still empty as far as that's concerned because we're just launching it and we've got a couple of methodologies in the development process, but none of them have been approved yet. But what will happen is the project owner now selects component methodologies, and then the selected component methodologies then auto-generates the template for the project report. The project report, I apologize if you hear some noises in the background. I think there are people on the roof of this building trying to do some maintenance. The component methodologies forms the template that is then generated. So in the project report, that's the equivalent in the CDM, you call it the PDD. Gold Standard's got a PDD, project design document. And in the BCS, it's called the project description, or PD. In the ICS, we call it the project report. And the template for that is generated by the component methodologies. So the component methodology has to contain all of the information that's required to generate that template. And then on completion of the data entry, on completion of this template, the ICS online platform then auto-generates the project report using the component methodologies. So this is the first function of the component methodologies, is to create a template with the data entry fields. And then once the project owner has completed that data entry, then it auto-generates the project report. In the operational phase, there are two ways in which monitored data can come into onto the platform. The first is through human entry. And the component methodology provides the template for data entry for the data that has to be entered by humans. And the second way is through IoT devices, and there the component methodology creates the rules through which that data is uploaded onto the platform. And then also for both types of data, the component methodologies tells you, or basically dictates, how the data is stored and how that data is used in calculations. The component methodologies are also used in the verification of emission reductions, in the same way as what the project report is auto-generated, the monitoring report is also auto-generated on the platform using the component methodologies. So in Tuesday's presentation, we did mention the idea of a smart contract. Sorry, just give me 1 second.
just gone down because the other Davies not answering. They'll ask the guys now if they could not.
Okay, thank you. So we've just had confirmation that we've contacted the building owners and asked them not to do maintenance for the next 2 hours. So if you do hear a noise, please excuse it. To come back to the component methodologies, what we mentioned in Tuesday's workshop is that the component methodologies is converted by the ICS platform into code that does all of these things, and that is one of the major differences between the ICS and all other existing carbon programs. This is a bit of a repetition. We did cover all of this in Tuesday's meeting, but fundamentally there are a couple of types. I think there's 6 types of component methodologies. The first is project details. The second is additionality, and I'm not going to go into the details here because we've got detailed slides on all of them. There's the baseline, then there's the monitoring, permanence, and tagging. So we'll get into the details of all of them when a little bit later in the presentation. This is also a bit of repetition, but just for completeness, it's what we call a swim lane model. What you see on the left-hand side is the different actors in the space, the different people that get involved. You've got the methodology owner, the accredited auditor, the Environmental Integrity Committee, the Standard Secretariat, and in the ICS platform. And in each of these lines, you've got the actions that's taken by that specific participant or player in the space. And the area that we focus on mainly today is where the methodology owner develops a new methodology. He actually enters the component methodology onto the platform. The platform then generates it based on the entry, and that's then sent back to the methodology owner. And in the later, the sessions that follow next week and the week after next, we will go into that in quite a lot of practical, technical detail, and we will walk you through step by step about how those processes work. I'm not going to go through too much detail on the rest of the process, but the main thing is that in order for a methodology to become available for the use on the system, it has to be approved by the Environmental Integrity Committee. This is a very important step because this is the point where the environmental integrity of the whole standard is guaranteed. So this process of approval of the component methodology is the most important part of the ICS when it comes to the guaranteeing of the environmental integrity. And for the purpose of carbon programs in general, environmental integrity is defined as to ensure that for every carbon credit issued, a ton of CO2 has actually been removed from the atmosphere. In other words, if you end up with a ton of CO2 carbon credit in your account, there's a guarantee that that emission reduction has actually happened. The approval process of methodologies can go via 2 routes. The one is called the audit route, and the other is called the review route. The decision on whether to go the audit route or the review route lies with the Environmental Integrity Committee, and they will take the decision based on the complexity of the component methodologies. Some component methodologies are very simple, like for instance, a project description. It basically says, tell us what the project looks like. There's no calculations in it. There's no requirements for assessing of legal issues. It's very simple. Describe your project. That is typically the type of project that can go through the review route. And then some are very complex. You may have a landfill gas project where there's quite a lot of measurements. There's flow measurement, there's temperature measurement, there's pressure, there's electricity. All of that comes in through IoT devices. The calculations are fairly complex. And that's typically the type of component methodology that will then be referred to the audit route. For methodologies that go the audit route, the onus and the cost of the audit is on the methodology owner. If the Environmental Integrity Committee decides that a specific component methodology has to go by the audit route, they will send it back to the methodology owner. The methodology owner will then appoint an accredited auditor. That auditor will then perform the audit and make a recommendation to the Environmental Integrity Committee. In cases where the audit route is not required, the Environmental Integrity Committee will get one of its members. That member will do a review of the component methodology and then make a recommendation to the Environmental Integrity Committee whether to approve the component methodology or not. If the component methodology is approved, then the Secretariat will activate it on the website, on the platform. When you go into actual working on the platform, you will see that each component methodology can have different statuses, and what they do to activate it is simply to change the status to approved, and then it becomes available. And it's at that point then where the project owners can then start using that methodology to actually develop projects, and then the methodology owner will receive royalties on the basis of the use of the methodology. Just some administrative processes. The task of the accredited auditor. First of all, the accredited auditor is appointed by the component methodology owner. So there is no relationship with respect to this specific task between the ICS and the accredited auditor. The accredited auditor is both appointed and paid for by the component methodology owner. The auditor assesses the proposed new component methodology and the example project. We don't put a lot of emphasis on the example projects in this presentation. We'll get into it a bit later. But fundamentally, when you develop a component methodology, you also have to upload an example project that shows how the component methodology is applied. So the accredited auditor will look at both of them and then forms an opinion of whether the methodology should be approved or not. During the audit process, the auditor communicates with the proposer of the component methodology through the ICS online platform. There's a full record of all communication, and that is for transparency. And this communication may, for example, include requests for clarification, requests for supporting documentation, or corrective actions that may be required. This is a very important part of the process because it provides the transparency that's needed to build the confidence and to be able to prove the environmental integrity of the ICS as a whole. The auditor then prepares an audit report. The auditor, this preparation happens in the same way as the project report and the monitoring report, because as the auditor goes through the audit process, he actually enters data onto the platform with respect to comments on specific issues or requests for information, or any question that he may have, any comment that he may have. And this audit report is then generated by the platform on the basis of the inputs that the auditor has made. And the outcome is a recommendation for approval or rejection of the methodology. Before you get to that point, there is provision for a couple of iterations where the auditor can, for instance, say, this is not quite clear, please explain, or yes, I understand this, but give supporting documentation, or you need to change this, this is not acceptable. So it's not a linear process where you submit and then either get approved or rejected. There is a provision in the system for feedback loops to make sure that the probability of eventual approval is maximized, and that in that process the environmental integrity can be guaranteed. The next role player in the administrative process is the Secretariat. The Standard Secretariat will take action when the methodology owner submits the proposed methodology. The proposed component methodology is presented to the Environmental Integrity Committee for a decision on the approval route. We covered it a bit earlier. In other words, whether it's going just for a review by an EIC member or whether it goes through the audit route. If an audit is required, and once the auditor submits an audit report to the proposed component methodology, the Secretariat puts the proposed new methodology on the agenda for the next meeting of the Environmental Integrity Committee, where it's then discussed. And once the Environmental Integrity Committee has approved the new component methodology, then it is the task of the Secretariat to activate the new component methodology on the ICS platform. If a new component methodology is a new version of an existing approved component methodology, then it is the task of the Secretariat to deactivate the existing component methodology at the appropriate time. And then just the last part of the administrative processes, and then we'll take a short break, is the Environmental Integrity Committee. And we've already covered this as well. There's basically two routes. You can go either through a review by a member of the EIC, or the Environmental Integrity Committee can ask that it goes through an audit and thereafter consider it for approval or not. I'd like to pause here and give people online a chance to just maybe ask questions or comment. I think if I just take this whole presentation and run through from start to end, everybody's going to fall asleep. So let us take a quick pause and any questions or discussion or comments from anybody. Simone, is there any questions in the chat maybe?
Nothing yet.
If there's no questions, then I assume everybody's fallen asleep. The one person on the group that's not asleep, can you just give us an indication that you're still awake?
Very much awake from Australia. Thank you, Robbie and Simone.
What's the time in Australia now?
It is 6:30 in the evening.
Yeah. Okay, so shall we move on? The requirements for new component methodologies. Before a component methodology can be approved, it must be established that the component methodology has unique features that are not covered by existing approved methodologies. In this context, the following should be considered with respect to the details of the proposed new methodology as compared to existing component methodologies. This is a difficult area of the ICS. The way it was structured, and we covered on Tuesday, the royalties that can be earned, and the purpose for that is to create a community where people have got a commercial interest in coming to the platform and participating. All of the component methodologies are open source. So what one would want to do is not to have somebody just copying and pasting somebody else's component methodology and start earning a royalty on a copy and paste job. So it is a difficult thing, and I think as we go into it and as the platform becomes live and we see more and more proposed new component methodologies, we will have to give a lot of attention to this, and the Environmental Integrity Committee will focus on it, I think in a big way. The first issue to look at is applicability criteria. So when we get into the structure of the methodology just now, you'll see that every methodology has to have applicability criteria. The applicability criteria basically tells you where you can use this methodology. For instance, let's say I've got a solar PV project. It is distributed generation. In other words, it's not a big grid project. And it uses an IoT device to feed data to the platform. That's an example. So anybody who now comes around and say, I've got a solar PV project, but I don't have an IoT device, I want to manually enter my data, that then gives you the opportunity to do a new component methodology. I think on the applicability criteria, it's important to explain that whereas the existing standards, like the CDM-VCS and Gold Standard, they've got a huge drive to consolidate methodologies. So they will bring more and more applicability criteria into a single methodology. And in the past 20 years of doing carbon credit projects, we have come to realize that that is one of the big problems in the carbon system, because the more complex a methodology becomes, the more difficult it becomes for the project owner to actually apply that methodology. So the purpose in the ICS is to have the methodologies as targeted as possible, as narrow as possible, but much rather end up with a whole host of methodologies where the burden of the administrative overhead is now placed, removed from the project implementer to the methodology development stage. So the applicability criteria forms a very, very important part of the development of all of the methodologies. In all methodologies, there are the matter of compatibility. A good example of how compatibility works is, let's say, for instance, I've got a baseline methodology, and the baseline methodology has got a certain variable for the baseline emissions. The actual emission reduction calculation is done in the monitoring methodology. But if the monitoring methodology doesn't have the same variable as the baseline methodology, then you cannot do the calculation, and then those methodologies are not compatible. So you may find that there are issues relating to the compatibility of methodologies that may require that you develop a new component methodology. So that's another reason to develop a new component methodology. And then if we look at the monitoring parameters, a new methodology may be required if other monitoring parameters or monitoring method is, or the monitoring method is different from existing methodologies. This goes, for instance, to the example I've just mentioned, where on the one hand, you may have a solar PV project that feeds data into the platform via an IoT device, but then you may have another one that's, for instance, implemented in a rural area where there's no cell phone coverage, and the data has to be entered manually, and that's then a different methodology. And then the monitoring parameters need to be specified in component methodologies in a way that maximizes the compatibility with other component methodologies. So you can't ring fence or create exclusivity simply by changing the monitoring parameters or the calculation parameters. If there is, for instance, a baseline methodology with monitoring with a baseline variables that can be used in your monitoring methodology, you have to fall back and use that. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the slide, this is a complex area, and we will be putting a lot of focus on refining the principles around this. And to a large extent, these are the principles, but the final implementation will require a lot of effort from the Environmental Integrity Committee side. For all component methodologies, irrespective of whether it's project description, baseline, monitoring, permanence, or tagging, there are certain common things. There are certain things that's required for all methodologies, and there are certain things that's not required. The things that's not required in the component methodologies, because the information is sourced from a different level, is first of all the owner information. So the component methodology doesn't have to say who the project owner is, because when the project owner logs on, the system already knows who he is. You cannot start a new project if you're not logged on and then your information is available. So the account through which the project is generated, that account is the project owner. The next piece of information that's not required in the component methodologies is the project title, because you actually enter that when you start, before you get to the point where you have got a drop down of the available component methodologies. The project title is already specified, and then the crediting period. The crediting period will start on the date that the project has been approved and activated on the platform, and then you can select the type of crediting period, and so the end date is then automatically defined by your selection of the type of crediting period. So those are pieces of information that you do not have to provide for in the component methodologies. The topics that must be covered by all component methodologies, irrespective of the type of methodology, is the applicability criteria. I mentioned earlier that every single component methodology must specify the applicability criteria. And examples of the applicability criteria are what types of projects the methodology is applicable to. For instance, this is applicable to a landfill gas project, or energy efficiency project, or a renewable energy project, or cook stoves, or whatever the type is. And again, here, the idea behind the ICS is to make this targeted, and to make it, to take the burden of the administrative overhead away from the project developer, to make the work of the project developer as little as possible by targeting these things as tight as possible. So we spoke about the types of projects that the methodology is applicable to, but also there may be project types that the methodology is not applicable to. To get back to the same example, let's say, for instance, it's a PV project through which the data is uploaded manually. Then you can say this monitoring methodology is not applicable to projects that uploads data through an IoT device. What technologies are applicable? So, for instance, you can say this methodology is applicable to solar PV, but not to solar water heating. So the technologies are specified there, and then also any other project-specific applicability criteria. For instance, if you look at a component methodology that deals with additionality, you can say that this methodology is applicable to very small projects that's rolled out into rural households, or any other very specific criteria that would constrain the applicability of the methodology. What we found in our experience in the other legacy carbon programs is that the wider the applicability criteria become, the more difficult the baseline and monitoring becomes. So let's say, for instance, you've got a renewable energy project that can generate electricity from biomass, or hydro, or solar, or wind. By the time you get to the baseline and the monitoring, your baseline and monitoring has to provide for the amount of biomass you get in, the baseline emissions associated with the production of biomass, the amount of water in the hydro system, and all sorts of things. So by making the applicability criteria more narrow, you actually simplify both your additionality, your baseline, and your monitoring component methodologies. Question? Fabian has got a question here in the room.
I have one is really short. Can one transfer ownership of a CM, of a component methodology?
Yeah.
Cool. So you could essentially create it for someone.
Yeah, you can.
Awesome. And then is there a possibility to like make maximum applicability kind of criteria in a component methodology? I'm specifically thinking in a say a land-based project.
Sorry, Fabian, I just want to worry if the people on the call can actually pick up. Is he speaking loud enough? Can you hear him? Or should
Yes,
I
Robbie.
Yeah, we can hear him.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, thanks, Fabian.
So what I specifically have in mind is say like an agricultural project where you can either model, or I'm thinking this in terms of like modeling for soil carbon or measure and remeasure kind of ways of measuring change. Can one say in one component methodology, is there ability to say you can either use, say, these two methods of change in greenhouse gas emissions from your baseline, or would one be, okay, one's going to be IoT for your, say, abiotic environmental factors driven from here, and the other component methodology, would you separate those just a measure remeasure model and a measure and model through kind of IoT abiotic factors of environmental over this 3 year course?
So the platform itself does not dictate one or the other. So you can upload a component methodology that has got 2 or 3 or 75 different alternatives to enter data.
Okay, so it's not, there's not a say,
so
you have to create a different,
No. So if you, when we get to the practicals, you'll see when you start uploading the methodology, each variable has to have a specific mode of data entry. You cannot have a single variable that can be entered via 2 routes. But what you can do is you can specify a manually uploadable variable and a IoT uploadable variable. You will then have to build the equation that makes sure that you can't double count. And that challenge is yours, because it's basically, this platform is for methodologies what Excel is for calculations. You can do the wrong calculation in Excel, and then that will come out in the audit process. But if, for instance, you upload a methodology that says, I can bring this variable in either via the IoT or manually upload it, in your calculation, you will then have to make sure that only one of the 2 can be used in the calculation, and that you can't use both.
So if one's triggered, then it pulls through.
So it's a mathematical programming language. You can do conditional statements in there. So you can say, Philip, tell me if I'm correct. Philip's shaking his head. He says, so you can say, if the data has been provided by IoT, then don't look at the manually uploaded data. So you can do that.
So you can apply multiple routes in one component.
And then on the just more universal requirements definitions, all components methodology must provide definitions and terms and concepts in the component methodology in such a way as to prevent misinterpretation of any part of the component methodology. There is when you look at the documents on inclusivecarbon.org, you will also find a document called the glossary, and what we will do in the evaluation processes of the methodologies is we'll try and stick as close to the language in the glossary as possible. Universal requirements again, report generation. This goes back to a comment that we made earlier, where the component methodologies basically becomes the code that generates the templates and eventually generates the reports. There are some cases where there's information that doesn't feature in all of the reports, but generally, in the drafting of the component methodology, one has to enter it in such a way that it results in human readable reports. So it's not only about the data, it's also about the narrative. And when we go into the examples that we've developed, you'll see that you write the data and the methodology in a way that when it's that data, not the data, the text, the narrative, when that narrative is then reproduced by the component methodology in the project report and in the monitoring report, then it actually generates the human readable reports. So in this respect, there are things that we put in the component methodologies in the ICS that you wouldn't normally see in CDM, BCS or gold standard methodologies, because of this requirement that the methodology must now form the basis of and produce this human readable report. Treatment of uncertainty and conservativeness. One of the principles of the issuance of carbon credits, and it goes very, very closely to the principle of environmental integrity, is to make sure that uncertainty is properly addressed. Those of you who've got experience in CDM projects, for instance, that use sampling, you'll know that you do a statistical analysis, you come out with a certain amount, a certain accuracy of your data, and that actually dictates what the amount of credits that you can get. But in the development of these methodologies, where there's uncertainty, the methodology has to also contain mechanisms to address the uncertainty. And this becomes specifically relevant in methodologies that use sampling in the monitoring part of the methodology. We now go into more detail of the project details component methodology. I assume there's no questions from anybody online, so I assume I can just keep on talking.
No questions.
No questions, okay. We'll now go through all the different types of methodologies and just talk a little bit about the requirements for each. So when you upload a proposed new methodology and you press the submit button, one of the very first things that will happen is before the Secretariat then passes it on to the Environmental Integrity Committee, they will have a checklist and tick some boxes to make sure that it is actually complete. So we'll go through these lists now. For the project details component methodology, you have to have the description of the project. It doesn't have to be very long. You can say basically this project puts cook stoves in rural households, for instance. The location, the boundaries, there you would look at things like the name of a district, a street address, GPS coordinate, or even GIS shapefiles. The platform has got a provision for the upload of basically just about any type of file. So if you've got a afforestation project with a very complex border, you would typically upload a GIS shapefile for that type of project. The boundary, this may include, but it's not limited to, for instance, the geographic boundary. You can say this project is implemented in the Eastern Cape. It could include activities, what activities are included in the boundary or not. The greenhouse gas emission sources. In other words, you can say that in this methodology, we consider only CO2 emissions and we exclude methane and nitrous oxide. Or you can say that this project looks at methane emissions, so the greenhouse gas emission sources, is included. You can include certain activities. For instance, if you look at CDM methodologies, you've got some small scale methodologies, for instance, that says that if biomass, for instance, is sourced in a radius of less than 200 kilometers, then the transport emissions associated with the bringing of the biomass to a specific plant is immaterial, and therefore it has been excluded. So you can include or exclude certain activities, raw materials, products, fuels. There's a lot of things that can go into the boundary. And it will be important when you develop this methodology to articulate all of those very clearly. The project details component methodology is the place where you specify the crediting period. For those of you who know the CDM, VCS and gold standard, you'll know that there's two options in those standards. It's either a 7-year crediting period that's renewable twice, or a single 10-year crediting period. We've put 5 years in for the very simple reason that this is what was formulated in the Paris Agreement. So up to 2015, when the Paris Agreement was agreed upon at the COP, the general consensus was that 7-year crediting periods renewable twice, which gives you 21 years in total, is acceptable. But the Paris Agreement reduced that from 7 to 5 years, and we suspect that Article 6.4, the Article 6.4 mechanism will align with the Paris Agreement because it's a Paris mechanism, and we think that standards like the VCS and gold standard will probably over time align with the Paris Agreement. So that is why we went from 7 years to 5 years. Also, in your project details component methodology, you have to address stakeholder consultation. There are requirements for both local and global stakeholder consultation, and your methodology has to provide, it has to say how the project developer, or it's got to require from the project developer to provide input so as to explain how the stakeholder consultation was conducted and the results thereof. And then there has to be a summary of local legal requirements and permitting details. For instance, if you need environmental authorization to be able to implement something, you've got to say, yes, I need environmental authorization, and this is a copy of the environmental authorization. The same goes for instance, rezoning of land. If you want to do something that requires that, or air emissions license or water use licenses. But by the time you register the project, you have to be able to prove that you've met all the legal and permitting requirements, and that the project details component methodology has to provide for this. For instance, if you implement a solar PV project on somebody's roof, you don't need any environmental approvals. You can just say no environmental approvals required. But if you are going to take a piece of farmland that has been lying fallow for the last 20 years and you want to start planting trees there, you'll probably have to do some sort of a environmental approval process for that. So that's got to be explained. Further information that's got to be in the project details component methodology is the risk assessment. We've mentioned on Tuesday that all projects has to do a high level, do no significant harm risk assessment. There is provision for that. It's described, there's a template for that risk assessment in the methodology manual. And then also all land-based projects must do an assessment in terms of the Cancun safeguards. This is a requirement that was introduced by the ICVCM. Sustainable Development Goals. The idea here is not to give a detailed description of how a project may contribute to the SDGs, because you can do that in detailed tagging methodologies. But what we would like here is just for projects to mention, to say, I do contribute to the following. Just as an overview for the general benefit of the reader. And then there's safeguards. The safeguards, some of it is a repetition of what I've just said before, but there is information on the prevention of double counting. In other words, how are you going to make sure, for instance, that a renewable energy project doesn't sell both carbon credits and RECs. Credit and project ownership. There is a declaration that the project owner has to sign that we'll get into a bit later. Details of local stakeholder consultations, environmental impact assessment that relates to the regulatory requirements we spoke about. And then we will recover the requirements for do no significant harm risk assessment and the Cancun safeguards. To move on to additionality, does anybody have any questions about project details, or can I move on to additionality?
Sorry, I asked this online also. The 5 year twice renewable, is it 5 years and then renewable twice? Or is it 5 years and then plus another 5?
It gives you 15 in total. So it's the first 5 years plus 1 renewable gives you 10, plus 2 renewals gives you 15 years.
And then re-establishment of a baseline would be CM based and not a requirement by the standard. That would be
on the renewal
of
a crediting period. You would have to reapply your baseline. Yes.
Okay, so it would essentially be the 5 years if it is 5, and
yeah,
and then if you would wanted to. Okay, cool. Yeah, that makes sense. The safeguards, I was asked this, I think on the mail. Sorry, I'm asking double questions. Is are they red aligned? I'm not so informed on the Cancun safeguard, but they in the standard or the manual, it mentions all land-based projects.
Yeah.
Would one have to apply those Cancun safeguards on, say, an agricultural project where it's not really a...
I'll have to go and check up. As far as I recall, the Cancun safeguards is applicable to red projects.
Yeah.
I'll just have to go and check up on that one.
Okay, cool. I mean, I can also go look. I'll do it on the weekend by Tuesday. I'll come back with maybe, because then just because it's red and then land based is like it's all.
Yeah.
How do they kind of overlap? I was thinking.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to go and check up on that. I've personally not worked on any project where the Cancun safeguards was relevant. The reason why we've included it is it's basically the ICBCM has included it as a requirement, and we think it's going to add a lot of value to the ICS if we can get the ICBCM core carbon principle stamp of approval.
Yeah.
So that's why we've included.
Have you guys looked at the VCMII, the integrity initiative?
Yes, but not to the same level as the ICBCM.
Okay.
So the VCM
integrity initiative.
Yeah, they focus more on the market. In other words, on what happens after the credit has been issued, where the ICBCM focuses more on the point up to the issuance. In other words, the carbon program.
That would make sense.
So that's how they interlink.
Okay. Cool, thank you.
On additionality, the requirements are, first of all, the approach that you use for additionality, and I think we've got a slide about that just now, so I'll go into detail. The overall mitigation of global emissions, that is again introduced by the ICBCM. And basically what it requires is that you in some way prove that your project does not lead to emissions elsewhere. I'm trying to think of an example now. But let's say, for instance, you implement a project in South Africa And because of the project you've implemented in South Africa, you now find that somebody in China must be burning more coal. This comes from the Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, and the ICVCM has taken it on board and put that as a requirement, and that's why we brought it in here. It's a fairly new concept, so if you want to ask me technical details about how exactly it will be implemented, the answer is we've got to figure it out. Regulatory surplus. We had a bit of a discussion on Tuesday about this when Mike was in the office here. Basically, the requirement is that if the law forces you to implement something, you can't get carbon credits for it. So you've got to prove that the law is not forcing you to do it. However, what we see in practical reality is that even though the law does say you've got to do something, and a good example is the SO2 emissions by Eskom in Mpumalanga in South Africa. The CDM has got interesting wording in. The CDM says you can't prove additionality if it's required by law, except where the law is widely not applied. So there is a little bit of leeway around the regulatory surplus, but it will be, the onus will be on the developer of the component methodology to actually prove that that's the case. Still on additionality, there's some principles in additionality. The first is to produce a positive list, or we won't actually have a positive list, but to look at automatic additionality. Automatic additionality basically says that if certain conditions are met, you don't have to prove additionality. The project is automatically deemed to be additional if certain conditions are met. One of them, for instance, is a technology penetration rate. If a technology, even though it is very, very profitable, if the penetration rate of a technology is less than 5% in the country or region, then it is deemed that there are other barriers to project implementation, and that carbon credits can actually make a contribution towards getting the projects implemented. This is consistent with the approach in other programs. For instance, in the CDM, all first of its kind projects is automatically additional. In the VCS, they've got a provision for automatic additionality for technology penetration rate. NDC targets. If I see Aaron has raised its hand. Aaron, do you want to come in here? Or?
Yeah, how's it, Robbie? Thanks, then. It's a question on the technology penetration rate. You know, how do we, by whose measuring stick is that done? You know, does that take into account electricity based on what's flowing through the grid? Is that decentralized? Let's say if we're looking at solar, for example, you know, how do we, who's measuring and with what stick are they using to go, okay, well, when do we reach that 5%?
I'm going to duck out of this question by saying the methodology, the methodology owner, the proposer of the component methodology has to make an argument, and that argument has to stand up to the scrutiny of the Environmental Integrity Committee. So in the beginning, it's a bit challenging, and I do apologize for being vague, but I think what will happen over time is we will, you know, like in law, you've got precedents. We'll have certain precedents set. So when the first one is submitted to the Environmental Integrity Committee, they'll probably have a very long discussion about it and decide on some principles based on some justification, and then things will become clearer. I think maybe just a slightly off topic, but relevant to this question, Aaron, is a lot of people in the development of this, of the ICS over the last couple of years have asked us principal questions to say, will you accept this type of project or that type of project? Especially, for instance, when the VCS banned all renewable energy, non-LDC countries that supply energy into the grid. We had a question, what about the ICS? Will the ICS allow this, yes or no? And my answer to that is that when we built the ICS, or in the process of building the ICS, we built the structure and the framework within which the standard can happen. But fundamental to the structure is the concept of independence and non-conflict by the Environmental Integrity Committee. So the Environmental Integrity Committee is a group of independent people that has committed to ensuring the environmental integrity of all the credits that come out of the system. So we, as the developers of the platform, have not taken any in principle decisions to say this is acceptable and that's not. What we're saying is we're building this system. The environmental integrity of the ICS is non-negotiable, and the way in which it will be implemented is to have these people that are independent, they are experts, they do not have a conflict of interest. They've got to sit down and say, yes, for reasons A, B, and C, we either accept this or don't accept it. And I think the answer to your question lies somewhere in that space as well. So when you develop a new component methodology for additionality and you say, this is, I want to prove additionality on the basis of penetration rate, this is what I propose, the Environmental Integrity Committee will look at it and say, yes, it's acceptable or no. Let's take PV, and I can keep on coming back to PV, not because I think there's a huge potential, but because it's a very simple answer. So let's say I go and I say, I'm going to put a PV panel on the roof of my garage. And somebody else may put it on the roof of his house. So therefore, anything that, for as long as all the PV panels on garages is less than 5% of electricity produced in South Africa, the Environmental Integrity Committee will look at it and say, actually, it's immaterial on which structure you put it. Yeah. So whether it's on your garage or your house, that's absolutely immaterial. So therefore, the probability that they'll reject that as a proof of additionality is hopefully zero.
Yeah.
If it's not zero, then they're morons.
Okay.
But if you go and say, we've had long discussions about PV, because you can say, is the installed peak capacity, does that have to be less than 5%, or does the production capacity measured in kilowatt hours per year have to be less than 5%?
Yeah.
There, I would argue, but the decision would have to be taken by the Environmental Integrity Committee. But I would argue that the generation capacity expressed in kilowatt hours per year, that should be less than 5%. But again, that's not my decision. The Environmental Integrity Committee will have to evaluate it and take an informed decision and give a well-reasoned answer.
Okay. And let's say, so this is under the heading of automatic additionality, right? Technology penetration rate. So that's not necessarily going to be something that has to be proven if you are not looking to obtain automatic additionality. So, I mean, you could go down the route of, not required by law. So your regulation additionality, which you have on the previous slide, and then, investment analysis, IRR, without having to go down the technology penetration rate. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, you don't have to go down this route. In other words, you could be earning carbon credits for something where the technology penetration rate is 100%.
Yeah.
There is the issue of common practice analysis, but I don't want to complicate it too much.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Robbie. Appreciate it.
The double dipping, so like tax incentives and this type of thing, and kind of ICCs.
So so just for everybody benefits, Fabian is asking,
It's again to do with the PV, I guess, as
Yeah.
an example, and this is getting very down that
Yeah.
track.
So generally, when we look at carbon credits, we say there's two questions to answer. The one is, can you make a carbon credit? And the second is, can you sell it? In the South African carbon tax regime, you can't get double benefits. So, for instance, you get Section 12L and carbon credits. That relates to the question of whether you can sell it into the carbon tax system and not on whether you can make it. So when we look at whether you can actually issue a carbon credit, we focus very strongly on the double issuance or double claiming or double benefit of environmental attributes. In other words, you can't register a project under gold standard and the ICS and issue credits on both.
And ZRX.
And you can't do it for both carbon. You can't get carbon and REX for the same kilowatt hour. But once you've issued the carbon credit, whether you get double benefit for it in the South African carbon tax system, that challenge is for the government that operates the carbon tax system.
So you stand with it, like,
Yeah.
away from that. Okay, cool.
Okay, can I move on to the next point? So the next point, and this, again, the next point isn't in any existing standard, but if you look at the Paris Agreement and specifically Article 6.2, Article 6.2 and 6.4 for that matter, refers to the ability of a national government to declare certain things additional in terms of the rules of that country. So we felt that if the Paris Agreement does that on a country level, then it should also be possible to do it under the ICS. So let's say, for instance, the South African government says that all clean cook stoves that is put into rural households are automatically additional. And you want to roll out cook stoves into rural areas, you can actually write a component methodology for automatic additionality that says, in line with this and this publication by the South African government, in which they've declared that with respect to Article 6.2, these projects are deemed to be additional, then it can also be additional. Another example could be, and again, this is not the exhaustive list, these are just examples. We call it picoscale technologies. In normal life, I would call it microscale, but in CDM speak, microscale is less than 5 megawatt, and in my life, 5 megawatt is actually mega. But let's say, for instance, you've got a project that's rolled out in a community, in an area where at least half the people are living below the poverty threshold, or if the estimated emission reduction is less than 10 tons of CO2 per installation per year, and there may be other examples. One can argue that those things should be automatically additional, and again, that argument should then be presented to the Environmental Integrity Committee that needs to look at it. The issue of the poverty thresholds come from the CDM. The CDM makes provision for things they call special underdeveloped zones. And in terms of the rules of the CDM, if a project, a very small project, is implemented in a special underdeveloped zone, then it is deemed to be automatically additional. The CDM actually limits it to a couple of technologies. And a special underdeveloped zone in the CDM is defined as an area, an administrative area, where more than 50% of the households live under the poverty threshold. So we've actually taken this from the CDM. And there may be other arguments for automatic additionality. This is not an exhaustive list. This is just examples. So people can come and make presentations or make proposals, and the Environmental Integrity Committee will have to look at it and then take a decision based on the principles of the ICS. The next is investment analysis. This is typical. Probably about 80% of all carbon projects registered to date has been done so on the use of investment analysis. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this. The rest is a barrier analysis. Barrier analysis are always very difficult to prove, but some are easier. two examples of a barrier analysis is, first of all, if a project has only carbon as revenue source. For example, let's say you've got a landfill gas flaring project, and the only carbon, you don't sell electricity, you don't do anything. The only revenue, the only way in which you can pay for the flare is through carbon revenue. Then the lack of other revenue is then a barrier to project implementation. And there's also something called the split incentive barrier. An example of that is, let's say there's a landlord that owns a shopping mall. The landlord can improve the ventilation in the shopping mall, but the benefit, the financial benefit of the improved ventilation actually goes to the shop owner who's got to pay for the electricity. So the capital cost of installation of an improved ventilation system lies with the landlord, but the economic benefit with respect to the electricity saving, that sits with the shop owner. That's an example of a split incentive barrier, and there may be others. There are definitely others, but one will have to look at it. The last one on additionality types is, we've had a lot of questions about the transfer of projects from other standards. And we say, in principle, it can happen. And if a project has been successfully registered under the CDM-VCS or gold standard, it's gone through a process of proving additionality. Then we say that we can argue that the additionality of that project has been proved, and you don't have to reprove the additionality under the ICS. Again, that will require a component methodology to be written and approved by the EIC. But in principle, that will be acceptable to prove additionality. That was additionality. Any questions about additionality, or can I move on to baseline?
No questions. Just time check, 45 minutes.
Sorry?
Go.
35.
Check, 45.
We always run out of time, probably because I talk too much. Baseline component methodologies. The things you have to have in a baseline component methodology is, first of all, a description of the baseline. Just for reference, the importance of the baseline is that when you calculate your emission reductions, the emission reduction calculation is always the differential between your baseline emissions and your project emissions. So in the baseline, you've got to do two things. You've got to specify the baseline. You've got to say, this is what it is. You've got to describe it. Like, for example, the baseline is electricity on the Eskom grid. And you've got to provide a way to calculate for it. In many cases, the baseline is fixed at the beginning of the project, but in some cases, the baseline can change, and you can actually have monitored parameters in order to calculate your baseline. The requirements for a baseline component methodology is, first of all, the description of the scenario. You've got to justify why it is the baseline scenario, the baseline emissions. That is the emission sources relevant to the baseline. The method for the calculation of the baseline emissions has to form part of the component methodology, and then also the uncertainty. So if there is uncertainty in the baseline, the values of the baseline emissions, you have to address it, and you've got to explain how it's being addressed. Level of service is something that can be relevant. It's not relevant in all cases, but basically you've got to say that the level of service in the project will not be differing from the level of service in the baseline in a way that can significantly impact the differential between the project emissions and the baseline emissions. Some example there is, let's say, for instance, you've got somebody uses 100 units of electricity per day in a household. All of a sudden, you give him a solar PV panel, and he now, because the electricity is for free, he now uses 1,000 units of electricity instead of 100. if you're going to use your emission calculation as the amount of electricity multiplied by the differential between the project and the baseline emissions, then you would get much more emission reductions because the people use more electricity, because the electricity is now so much cheaper. So one has to assess the risks associated with that in the development of the baseline component methodology, and if required, if necessary, you've got to address it. Monitoring component methodologies. You've got to first of all define your monitoring plan. You've got to describe the monitoring system, including metering, and it's more than metering. There's also, if there's manually collected data, how it's collected and how it's stored and entered. If there is IoT devices, you've got to supply a line diagram of how the meters look like, what they measure, how they feed into the system. And then you've got to describe both the monitoring procedures as well as the monitored variables. All of that has got to be described in the monitoring methodology. Further in the monitoring methodology, in some cases you get leakage. Leakage is emissions that happen outside of the project boundary because the project is implemented. An example there is, let's say, for instance, you're going to use wood chips from a local sawmill to generate electricity. But in the baseline, the wood chips was actually supplied to villages, and the villages used to burn the wood. Now, because you're taking all the wood, the villages now start burning coal. That's an example from leakage. So there's emissions from coal that happens outside the project boundary because you're now taking the wood, because the project's implemented. So in the monitoring component methodology, you have to identify whether there is leakage in the specific project type, where this methodology is applicable, and if there is leakage, you've got to provide methods to monitor it and to account for it. Uncertainty, we've spoken about this a couple of times. We've also covered it in the baseline. If there's uncertainty, you've got to say what the uncertainty is. The methodology has to address how the uncertainty will be managed. And then the emission reduction calculation forms part of this component methodology as well. Here you would draw variables from your baseline methodology and from the monitored data. And you've got to specify the equations to do this calculation in the monitoring methodology. Permanence. Permanence, I think, is fairly complex. Yeah, there you've got to look at identification of all the risks. There can be internal risks, there can be external risks, there can be natural risks, overall risks. You've got to figure it out, how those risks can impact the risk of a removal of the carbon sequestration or the emission reduction. You've got to provide information in terms of the calculation of those risks and also information related to the mitigation of those risks. Tagging component methodologies, we touched on it on Tuesday. There are 3 types of tags. The first is for markets. So there you can say this credits from this project comply with, for instance, the South African carbon offset regulations, or complies with the requirements of a specific large international corporate buyer with respect to value chain emissions, and there may be other things as well. Co-benefits, typically one can say this project is tagged to contribute to this specific SDG or whatever social co-benefit you want to put in, or natural co-benefit. And then share of proceeds. This is something that doesn't exist in the other standards, in the other carbon programs, but we've been approached by certain people, and we think there is a need to be able to tag a credit to say that a certain fraction of the proceeds from the carbon of this project has gone to that specific application. An example there is you would put in a monitoring plan that says that for all the carbon credits that's generated in this project, 10% or 50% or 95%, whatever, went back to the community where the project was implemented or was used for the specific purpose. The buyer of the credits will then know that the money he spends to buy the credits goes towards a specific cause. Tags that are included must include the following inputs: criteria with respect to which the project owner must comply at the validation of the tag, and then similarly certain criteria that requires for the ongoing verification of the tag. Let's say, for instance, you do a use of proceeds. At the validation step, the technology of the methodology may require that the project owner submits a, let's say, a legal agreement that says, I'm going to give so much of this credits to that cause, or a declaration that says it's going to do it. And in the ongoing verification, you may look at it and say, of the previous issuance, how much did you actually push towards that cause? That's just an example. And then in certain instances, the component methodology developer may engage with authorities outside of the ICS, such as government, for example, to ensure compliance with tags. So what you could do, for instance, is you could go and sit down with the carbon offset administrator in South Africa, and you can say, these are the rules for inclusion or for eligibility in terms of the South African carbon tax system, and you can do some sort of a come to some sort of agreement with respect to how you prove that those credits actually are acceptable in that market. We are very close to the end, so maybe we'll make the time. Any questions on the requirements for specific methodologies? No questions.
No question.
Okay. I've just got a very, very short part on the actual uploading of formula. The reason is I think that it's a lot more practical if one logs onto the system and you actually look at what you've got to do. I personally think that the development of monitoring component methodologies is the more complex part of it, the more difficult part of it, because you do have to have some sort of a feel for the syntax of AMPL. But basically what you've got to do is you've got to translate the physical world into data and math. Typically what you see in a calculation is your emissions. For instance, this is example, emissions from the combustion of a certain type of fuel is equal to the combustion of the quantity of the fuel that you combusted multiplied by the emission factor. So for instance, you would here say the quantity of fuel you had was 100 tons of coal. Your emission factor was 3.2 tons of CO2 per ton of coal combusted. So that would give you, for instance, 320 tons of CO2 emitted. All of that, as I've mentioned, runs through a solver called AMPL, which is an abbreviation for a mathematical programming language. And what we've got is we have got the ICS platform that basically produces, and here Philip must help me, but produces the query that's sent to AMPL. AMPL solves it and sends the answer back. So that's what's happening in the back end. When we look at AMPL, and again, I think this is a very, very high level, and we'll dig into it deeper in the next sessions, but you've got things called sets. The sets are used to compute values that form part of a collection of data, for example, the periods in which electricity is generated. So your set can say, this is the amount of electricity generated in January, this is the amount in February, this is the amount in March, or this is the amount on the 1st of January and the 2nd of January. So you've got to define that. There's parameters. Parameters are they measured or other input values to the calculation? Parameters can come in several sources and inputs, such as from users or IoT devices. You've got variables. These are defined by the methodology owner, and the little table, gray table down in the bottom right-hand side shows you an example of variables, like for instance, the monitoring start period or the monitoring end period. And then the equations, I've actually showed a equation on the previous page, but you enter all of that onto the platform, and then that forms part of the component methodology. Example, you can have emission reduction equals baseline emissions minus project emissions. The baseline emissions equals the amount of electricity generated, for in this case EG, multiplied by EF, which is the emission factor. And your project emission could be, for instance, the amount of electricity consumed multiplied by the emission factor. And all of that is then entered into the platform, and the platform does the calculation. Validity and revision of component methodologies. A methodology remains valid and in use until one of the following events happen. Either the methodology is withdrawn from use by the Environmental Integrity Committee. Let's say, for instance, a methodology has been approved, and all of a sudden we realize this is wrong. This should never have happened. There's a fundamental flaw in this. The Environmental Integrity Committee does have the right, with good justification, to withdraw methodologies from use, or if it's replaced by a new version or a revised version. Approved component methodologies available on the ICS platform can be revised. The revision of an approved component methodology can be triggered by any of the following. Either the EIC, Environmental Integrity Committee, may request the methodology owner to revise it. The methodology owner himself can decide to revise it, or a project owner that uses a specific component methodology can request the methodology owner to revise the methodology. Further on the validity and revision of component methodologies, the procedure for revision of component methodology is the component methodology owner uploads a revised version. So it's exactly the same process as the original development of the methodology. He basically goes and he uploads the new version, and the proposed revision is processed and approved in the same way as a new component methodology. What happens when this is approved, then that becomes available as another approved methodology. There may be requirements for the phasing out of the old one, but because the previous version is now baked into the project report and the monitoring reports of the projects that actually run on it, you can't just cancel. So there are certain procedures in place to make sure that the old versions are then phased out and the new versions are then phased in. Just maybe some brief notes on the declaration of methodology ownership. This is important because the methodology owner will earn royalties out of the we call it a by the methodology owner, and it has to be stamped by a commissioner of oaths. So it's a declaration under oath by the methodology owner. Declarations are, first of all, the signer says, I've got the authority to sign it. And secondly, he says, I declare that I am the legal owner of this methodology. It is my own work. I have developed it. I've got the right to claim it. And then there are certain warranties. So he warrants that it is original work. In other words, that he didn't copy and steal it from somebody else. And he also warrants that the submitted component methodology does not contain any false, misleading, or fraudulent information. And then if there is a breach of these conditions, then the EIC has got the right to cancel the component methodology, and the methodology owner will then lose all the rights that he's got. In other words, the royalties that comes out of it. Framework for risk assessment. Yeah, we spoke about the do no significant harm risk assessment. First of all, you define the boundary. Then you identify the potential impacts, assess the significance, develop mitigation measures for the risks, determine the residual risk, develop a do no significant management plan if appropriate. And then there's also provision for consultation with stakeholders and engagement, and also for documentation and reporting of the findings. Did I make it in time?
Yeah, you did.
Cool. Now we've got hopefully a little bit of time for questions and discussion. Any questions from anybody?
Robbie, perhaps some clearer distinction between the component methodology and the actual project. Because we say with the component methodologies, these are the things that are required, let's say for the monitoring or the baseline. But what we're really saying is that the component methodology must ask the question to the project developer related to these topics. I know it's a double step, but there haven't been any queries on.
It's very, very, very valid comment, Philip, because we have actually had these questions in the past. So yeah, it's very valid. Any more questions? I think to slightly build on what Philip has said, it's very easy to interpret all the slides that I've presented this morning in the context of looking at it from a project developer or project owner perspective. And Philip's point is that the context of this is not from a project owner's perspective to say, this is where my project is implemented. The context is from a methodology developer's perspective to say, when you develop the methodology, these are the questions you've got to ask the project developer. And it's very easy to mentally not make that distinction and slide into looking at it from a project owner's perspective. So you have to look at it, and all of these items here, you have to look at it from the perspective of, when I write the recipe for project implementation, this is what I've got to keep in mind when I write that recipe. Modi, react, speak to me. Hunker, I see you're unmuted. You normally talk more than what you're talking today. Okay, if there's no more questions, then we actually get some discount on the time. The next session is on Tuesday. What we will do at the next session is we will do a walkthrough, show and tell of the actual platform. You can imagine the complexity of the platform when you look at the scope of what we spoke about. You look at all the breadth of the scope of what one can potentially put into the methodologies, the management of the whole approval process on the platform, and then the use thereof and all the documents that's generated by the system. Yeah, we'll take you on a tour through the platform on Tuesday. And then thereafter, we will have a couple of sessions where we literally sit down and show you, worked examples of methodologies that has been developed, and just go through step by step to say, this is what you do here, this is what you do there, this is what happens at this point, this is what happens at that point. So if there's no questions, I think I will just say thank you everybody for attending. I really do appreciate the time, the commitment that you make to listen to this. We do think that the ICS has got the opportunity to make carbon finance accessible to many projects that have not been able to access carbon finance before. We do notice globally that especially the voluntary carbon market is on a sustained growth path. There's a lot of carbon finance becoming available in the market, and if carbon credits can be used to channel those funds to good projects, it can really, I think, make a difference to the world. So please stay involved and talk to us, and let's get methodologies on the platform so that people can start building projects. With that, I'll see hopefully all of you, hopefully most of you, and hopefully some more people on the next call.
Thank you, Robbie and Simone.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
Pascal.
guys. Have a
Thanks,
nice
guys.
day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Looking
Okay.
forward.
Thank you.
Bye bye, everybody.